Ever since I was a little kid, I was used to packing up and moving every few months. Our family never stayed in one place for more than 3 to 6 months. When I was younger, I actually found it exciting to travel to so many different places. We lived in a big, multi-generational household. There was my grandma, my uncle's family, including my uncle, his wife, and my 2 cousins, and my own family, my parents and me. We always lived together as one tight-knit unit. But as I grew older, I started to hate this nomadic lifestyle. Eventually, my feelings turned from simple annoyance into a deep realization that my family was not normal. First of all, my grandma and my uncle were always treated with an extreme amount of respect by random people. Every now and then, incredibly expensive gifts would show up at our house for no reason at all. On top of that, complete strangers would know my name and my cousins' names perfectly. They would even use our family nicknames before we even knew who they were. Whenever I asked about it, the adults would just brush it off and say these people were old friends or longtime acquaintances. There was also a strict, unspoken rule among the adults in the house. Whenever a major topic needed to be discussed, they would immediately switch to Spanish. They would purposely lower their voices so us kids couldn't understand a thing. At first I had a lot of questions, but over time, I just got used to it. I only let it go temporarily though. I could never completely shake the feelings of curiosity and frustration. It felt like I was being locked out of my own family. The turning point came when I was 17 years old. One night, I went down to the kitchen to get a glass of water when I heard my aunt pull my mom aside. Her voice sounded incredibly tense. Both of them immediately switched to Spanish, just like they always did. But what they didn't know was that I had been secretly teaching myself the language. I never expected that learning a new language would be the exact tool that exposed my family's deepest secret. Through their hushed conversation, I learned that one of my uncles had just been found dead on the exact day he was released from prison. The way my aunt spoke about his death was chillingly calm. She didn't sound shocked or heartbroken at all. I heard phrases like, if he got out of prison, it was only a matter of time before they found him. Then, they continued to whisper about how they have already started looking for people, and how he needs to get to the border before the weekend. The way they talked made me realize this wasn't an unexpected tragedy. It was something they had been mentally preparing for a very long time. My curiosity quickly turned into a dark obsession, and I began investigating my family's past on my own. At first, I just memorized the names I occasionally overheard in adult conversations. Then, I started looking them up online. I found several old news articles from Texas and Arizona covering my uncle's case. He had been arrested for his involvement in a massive drug smuggling ring, which was why it made the local news. As I traced our family roots even further back, to the time before my grandma packed up the family and immigrated from Mexico to the United States, I uncovered a bloody, horrific truth. For generations, my family had been deeply embedded in the criminal underworld of the Mexican drug cartels. My bloodline was tied to everything from large-scale drug trafficking to contract killings meant to silence witnesses. The names I used to hear whispered in the living room weren't just distant relatives. They were specific links in a massive criminal network. The man I always thought was just a strict, ordinary uncle was actually the person running this branch of the family on the US side. Less than a month after the night I eavesdropped on that conversation, horrific news began piling up. A few relatives over in Mexico were reported missing. Others were found dead. Some vanished completely without leaving a single trace. But this time, I noticed the adults in the house weren't as calm as they tried to appear. My grandma would stay up all night long just to pray. My uncle became incredibly irritable, and he strictly forbade us kids from going outside by ourselves. For the first time in my life, I finally put all the pieces of the puzzle together. I understood that my family had never moved around randomly. We didn't move for work, and we didn't move for money. We were running for our lives. Every single move was an attempt to cut our tracks before someone could find our new location. The fact that the adults kept us in the dark and constantly forced us to pack up was actually their desperate way of protecting the kids from cartel hits. I don't know what my parents, my aunt, or my uncle did firsthand in the past. It is possible they never personally committed a crime. Or maybe they were just trying to survive a cycle they were born into and could never escape. But in the end, I realized none of that really matters anymore. In the eyes of the people hunting us, we are all part of the same bloodline. And sometimes, just carrying the wrong last name is enough to become a life sentence of running forever. Since I was a child, I always grew up hearing the story that my father abandoned me right after I was born. In a way, that wasn't a lie, but the truth behind it was much more horrific and twisted than that. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, and I got used to not having a father present at any of my major milestones. My mother rarely spoke about the past. Whenever I asked who my father was, she just said he wasn't worth mentioning. The rest of the family shared the exact same attitude whenever I brought him up. They just told me he was a worthless coward. The first crack in the story happened because of a slip of the tongue by my cousin during a visit. He looked at my dark hair and mentioned that I looked like my mom because your dad was blonde and your mom has dark hair. That comment caught my attention immediately. I remembered very clearly that everyone else had always told me my father had dark hair. Aside from that, there was another detail that had always made me feel vaguely out of place as a kid. My last name was Smith, while everyone else in the family shared a completely different last name. When I first started noticing this difference, my grandmother explained that after my father left, my mother was so heartbroken and filled with hatred that she just flipped through a baby name book, picked a random last name, and wrote Smith on my paperwork. That explanation was enough to satisfy me when I was little. But after my cousin's comment, it started to sound completely fake. I began paying much closer attention to the stories about my father and my true identity. Everything finally blew up when I turned 20 and began the process of enlisting in the military. To complete my file, I was required to submit the original copy of my birth certificate. The moment I held that legal document in my hands, I froze completely. In the section for father's information, a name was printed clearly and sharply: Alexander Smith. I was stunned. It turned out my last name was Smith simply because it was his last name, not because of some random baby name book. My family had lied to me. I didn't confront them right away. The birth certificate gave me a name, Alexander Smith, and the location where I was born. That was enough to narrow things down. For the next few days, my eyes were practically glued to my computer screen as I tracked public databases, civil records, court documents, and background check websites. Alexander Smith is a very common name, but once I filtered it by age and location, the list got much shorter. Then, I found a record that made my hand freeze on the mouse. This man had lived right in my family's area at the exact time I was born. The archived files showed that Alexander Smith was not his birth name. It was a name he legally adopted after immigrating to the United States from Russia. Right then, I suddenly remembered a DNA kit I had done a few years ago to check my ancestry. The results showed that most of my heritage came from Eastern Europe, with my Russian ancestry coming in at a massive 70%. My grandmother was Russian. I had always known that. But if I only inherited it from her side, the percentage couldn't possibly be that high because my mother was biracial. From my grandmother to me, that number should have only been around 25%. There was only one possible explanation. My father was Russian too. The final piece of evidence that made me 100% certain this man was my father also pushed me into a state of extreme psychological trauma. In the section listing Alexander Smith's biological mother, the name read clearly, Natasha Kelovich. And Natasha Kelovich was my grandmother's maiden name. I stared at that name until the letters began to blur. If these documents were correct, Alexander Smith wasn't just my biological father. He was also my grandmother's son, meaning He was my mother's brother. That evening, I laid out everything I had discovered right in front of my family. This time, nobody tried to deny it. My mother could only sit there and sob, unable to utter a single word. Finally, my uncle spoke up, his voice catching heavily in his throat. Alexander really was my biological father, the son of my grandmother's first marriage. I was the product of abuse, a horrific crime that the entire family had tried to bury for years out of pure shame and trauma. Right after I was born, he hated my very existence. One night, when I was only a few days old, he used a pillow to cover my face to get rid of me. Luckily, my uncle caught him just in time and tackled him away. He escaped into the night, but my family immediately called the police, and a warrant was issued for his arrest. A few weeks later, Alexander came back in the middle of the night. Since his plan to kill me had been discovered and stopped by the family, he didn't give up. Instead, he turned to an even more brutal plan, erasing everyone else. He set fire to our house. The fire quickly raged out of control, spreading to the neighbor's house and taking the life of an elderly woman. After that incident, he was caught, sentenced to life in prison, and eventually died behind bars. I sat there listening to the whole story, completely numb, not knowing how to react. Every word felt like a physical blow to my head, leaving me dizzy. I looked at the faces of the people who had raised me. I looked at my mother, who had endured such horrific suffering and trauma, but still chose to give birth to me. In a single evening, everything I thought I knew about myself was stripped away. I understood why they chose to hide the truth, but that understanding didn't make the pain any easier to bear. My uncle told me the family had planned to write me a letter explaining everything once I officially deployed with the military. They wanted me to be strong enough to handle the truth, but I had found it out on my own first. So it turned out I had two versions of a father to process. One was the man I thought abandoned my mom and me when I was a baby. The other was the monster who abused my mother and tried to murder me the moment I came into the world. Since that day, I don't dream about an absent father anymore. I dream about a white pillow coming down over my face, and in the darkness, a blonde man standing over me, staring down with pure hatred in his eyes. My name is Jason, and I'm a freelance graphic designer living in Los Angeles. To give you a little background, I've always had a very casual and open-minded view on relationships. I lived that lifestyle for years until I was forced to learn a very expensive lesson. Because my work is pretty isolating, mostly working from home, I often use dating apps to find short-term flings. If things went well, they might last a bit longer, but never more than 3 months. Everything started getting messy when I met a girl named Maddie. She was attractive, confident, and a great talker. I found myself getting swept up in her before I even realized it. Maddie was probably the first person to actually make me feel that excited in a long time. After texting for a few days on Tinder, we decided to meet up at a small bar in downtown LA. The date was a blast. Maddie was even more forward and open than I expected. Everything went exactly according to plan when I brought her back to my apartment. While things were getting intense and passionate, Maddie suddenly put something small, smooth, and slightly bitter into my mouth. My brain was foggy with excitement, so I just assumed it was some kind of party pill or something to enhance the night. Without a second thought, I swallowed it. That night was physically exhausting. I fell into a deep sleep near dawn, completely wiped out. The next morning, I woke up alone in my apartment. Maddie was gone. Usually I'm the one who ends things and leaves, but this time, I was the one left behind. I tried to shift my position in bed and immediately felt my whole body aching. When I tried to get up, A wave of strange symptoms hit me. Dizziness, nausea, a racing heart, and a burning sensation spreading through my skin. I had to grab onto the bedpost, gasping for air in total panic. Right then, my phone buzzed with a text from Maddie. When I opened it, it became even harder to breathe. She told me that I had swallowed something special, and if I didn't want to die in agony, I had to follow her instructions. I immediately remembered the pill she gave me the night before and cursed under my breath. I couldn't accept being backed into a corner or forced to do what someone else wanted. Besides, she was talking crazy, and I didn't fully understand what she meant. When I didn't reply right away, she sent a string of messages describing my symptoms in perfect detail. She warned me that things would only get worse without the antidote. She demanded a large sum of money and told me not to call the police. This crazy woman made me furious. I shot back an angry text filled with insults, telling her to stop this insane game. I threw my phone aside and tried to head to the shower to clear my head, but after only a few steps, a massive wave of vertigo sent me crashing to the floor. I thought about calling friends for help, but what would I even say? That a one-night stand drugged me and was now blackmailing me? No way. That wasn't the cool guy image I had spent years building. I searched online for toxins that caused my symptoms, but I couldn't find a perfect match. As noon approached, my limbs started shaking uncontrollably. I was drenched in a cold sweat and my strength was fading fast. Thinking I was actually about to die, I shiveringly texted Maddie that I would pay. I had to drag my soulless body to an ATM, cursing my own stupidity and lifestyle the entire time. After withdrawing the cash, I took it to the drop-off point, an abandoned parking lot on the outskirts of town. I left the bag in the designated spot. Before leaving, I couldn't help but scream out a curse, feeling bitter that I was so helpless. I felt my body giving out. I felt like death was knocking on my door, yet the antidote still hadn't been sent. Finally, I threw away all my pride and called her. As soon as Maddie picked up, I broke down in tears. I begged her to send the cure because I didn't want to die. Suddenly, she burst out laughing. She told me that no grown man dies from a single blood sugar pill. Then she hung up and blocked me. I sat there in the middle of the parking lot, stunned. My mind was blank. After a moment, I used the last of my energy to look up hypoglycemia medication. It turns out that when a healthy person takes this medicine, it crashes their blood sugar to dangerously low levels. This causes a list of symptoms: shaking, sweating, rapid heartbeat, dizziness, and most importantly, extreme anxiety and restlessness. I'd been scammed perfectly. Maddie didn't use a deadly poison. She used my own fear and lack of knowledge to rob me. I lost a huge amount of money, not because of a toxin, but because of a cheap pill and the price of being reckless. I was more angry at myself than I was at the con artist. It's true what they say. Stupidity always comes with a price tag. I learned a deep lesson that day. I swore to myself I would never do one-night stands or casual flings ever again. If you're planning on swiping on Tinder tonight, please remember my story. Ever since I was a little girl, I knew there was something deeply wrong with my family. Every time my grandfather showed up, everyone in the house became uncomfortable, tense, and distant. Grandpa always gave me a horrible feeling of anxiety and fear. I am obviously a girl, and since I was little, I loved wearing pretty dresses, but my grandfather absolutely refused to acknowledge it. Every single time he looked at me, he would stare intensely and call me his grandson. When I complained to my parents in frustration, they just sighed. They told me to ignore him, saying he was just old, weak, and losing his mind, so I shouldn't take it to heart. His bizarre attitude, combined with how coldly my parents treated him, made me completely dislike the man. Then, when I was 12 years old, my grandfather died suddenly from a stroke. The funeral was held at his old house. A huge crowd of relatives gathered, but there was one detail that even a child like me couldn't help but notice. Not a single person actually seemed sad or shed a tear. The air in the house was heavy and suffocating, but it wasn't from grief. The adults all had cold, stern faces and quietly talked among themselves just to get the burial over with as quickly as possible. Feeling completely choked by the atmosphere, I sneaked out alone to the backyard garden behind my grandfather's house to find some peace and quiet. While I was out there, I noticed a little girl sitting perfectly still under a tree. She was wearing a very old-fashioned dress. Her hair was cut short right at her chin, and her face was incredibly pale. I walked up to her and asked who she was and why she was in my grandfather's garden. But the little girl didn't say a word. She just looked up at me and smiled. The smile wasn't scary, it was just deeply confusing. Right at that moment, my dad suddenly called out loudly from behind, startling me. He walked over quickly with a worried look on his face and asked what I was doing out here all by myself. I pointed toward the tree and told him there was a little girl sitting right there, but when I turned back around, the spot where I was pointing was completely empty. I saw my dad frown for a brief second, and then he told me that he only saw me standing there talking to a tree. That night, I fell into the most horrific nightmare of my life. I dreamed that I was standing in that same backyard garden from earlier that afternoon. The little girl was still sitting under the tree, completely silent. But this time, her face looked incredibly frantic, and she kept pointing her finger down at the dirt beneath her feet over and over again. Then, suddenly, the entire dream turned a dismal gray. The little girl's pale skin began to change into a bruised, purplish blue color. Her eyes stretched wide open without blinking, and a dark black liquid began to pour from the corners of her eyes. I screamed and bolted upright in my bed, drenched in sweat and shaking all over in total panic. I immediately ran straight into my parents' bedroom, crying hysterically as I told them about the strange encounter from the afternoon and the terrifying nightmare I just had. My mom held me tight to comfort me, but my dad's reaction was completely different. He sat there in total silence, lost in thought for a long time. I had never seen my dad look like that before. I ended up sleeping in my parents' room for the rest of the night. When I woke up the next morning, my parents' room was empty. My dad had left the house in the early hours of the dawn. At the time, with the mind of a 12-year-old child, I had absolutely no idea where he went or what he planned to do after hearing my bizarre story the night before. Everything happened in a terrifying silence, leaving me completely confused and anxious. It wasn't until much later, when everything was far in the past, and I was old enough to be told the whole story, that I finally understood the shocking truth of what happened that morning. After staying up all night, my dad immediately called my oldest uncle and a few close relatives first thing in the morning. They gathered together, grabbed shovels and tools, and headed straight back to my grandfather's old house. Right at the exact spot under the tree where I had pointed, they dug into the ground for hours. And then, a horrific truth was uncovered. Buried deep beneath the dirt was a small wooden chest that had rotted away over time. When they pried the lid open, everyone present froze in horror at the sight of a tiny human skull resting inside. Right next to it was a yellowed birth certificate with a clearly readable name, Barbara. For the next few days, our house was wrapped in a suffocating, somber silence. It was then that the brutal reality of my family was finally revealed through my dad's words. Barbara was my dad and my uncle's youngest sister. She was my aunt. When she was only 3 years old, she was sold by her own father, my grandfather. For decades, my grandfather told everyone that times were so desperate and starving back then that he was forced to sell his daughter to a stranger just to get money to feed the rest of the family. Right after that tragedy, my grandmother fell into a deep depression, became extremely sick, and passed away at a very young age. When they grew up, my dad and my uncle asked about their sister's whereabouts many times, hoping to find her, even if there was only a tiny shred of hope. But my grandfather always dodged the question and got angry, never revealing who had bought Barbara or where she was. The two brothers searched for their sister for years, but it was completely hopeless. It wasn't until that chest was dug up that the real truth finally came to light. Barbara had never been sold. She had been murdered by my grandfather. My blood ran cold hearing this, and I couldn't bring myself to believe my grandfather was capable of doing such a thing. From that day on, every time I looked at his portrait, I felt pure terror. Now, at 50 years old, looking back at the entire story, I am still haunted by a different theory that I came up with myself. I believe my grandmother knew the truth. She might have witnessed it with her own eyes, or discovered what happened to her daughter but was unable to speak out. Her severe depression probably wasn't just because she lost her child, but because she had to live under the same roof as the man who murdered her daughter. And sometimes I wonder, that chest buried under the tree, did my grandfather really put it there? Or was it my grandmother who buried it as a final way to keep her daughter as close to her as possible? My name is Ricky, and I live in California. This story happened 2 years ago. At that time, I had to drop out of college because I couldn't afford the tuition. To make ends meet, I got a job working in a supermarket warehouse. I rented a room in an old boarding house, sharing the space with another college student to save money. The first few days were pretty quiet. I worked shifts, so I still had time to rest and hang out with friends. The house seemed normal enough until I started noticing the landlady. After being there for a few weeks, I ran into her more often. She was around my mother's age, thin, with eyes that always seemed to be watching everything very closely. I noticed that whenever we spoke, she would stare at me for a long time, which made me feel awkward. She often commented that I was too skinny and needed to eat more. I just laughed it off, thinking she was just a caring landlord. About a month into my stay, she started bringing me food. These were always home-cooked meals. At first, it was just a few times a week, but soon, it was almost every day. What surprised me was how well she remembered exactly what I liked to eat, even though I'd only mentioned it in passing. She would often stand there and watch me eat, asking if it tasted good. She also started acting very familiar with me, like touching my shoulder or fixing my collar. These movements felt very natural to her. At first, I didn't think much of it. I actually felt grateful, like I was being looked after by a mother figure. But that feeling didn't last long. Her attention started to become obsessive. She would constantly ask where I was going, who I was with, and what time I'd be back. If I said I was going out with friends, she would grill me for details about them. One time, she caught me getting ready to head out with a close friend. When he politely said hello to her, her expression turned cold and resentful. That night, when I got home, she ambushed me with aggressive questions about my friend, making me feel extremely uncomfortable. The line was officially crossed when she started entering my room without permission while I was out. At first, she claimed she was just cleaning. Then, she started doing my laundry, including my underwear. I only realized this when I found my clothes folded with unusual neatness. It really creeped me out. The breaking point came on a day I felt sick. I left work early and went back to my room in the afternoon. When I opened the door, I froze. She was standing in the middle of my room. She looked at me perfectly calm. I was angry and asked what she was doing there, but she ignored my reaction. Instead, she walked up to me and placed her hand on my forehead. She kept it there for a long time, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I backed away to show I was uncomfortable, but she got annoyed, saying I was only sick because I hadn't been eating the food she cooked for me. After that, I decided to be blunt. I told her clearly that I didn't want her in my room and that she needed to respect my privacy. She stared at me without blinking. It was obvious she heard me, but she didn't really respond. I will never forget the hollow, blank look in her eyes during that confrontation. Despite my warning, she kept acting the same way. Since I didn't have enough money to move out, I was forced to stay, even though I felt a constant sense of dread. The next disturbing thing happened when my roommate moved out. It seemed like the landlady had arranged it. She told me that living alone would be better, and that no one would bother me anymore. I was truly terrified, but I had no other choice. From then on, I lived in a state of total avoidance. I tried to come home as late as possible, avoided her at all costs, and always made sure my door was locked tight. One night, I came home late and was exhausted. I just wanted to crash. As I lay down, I heard a faint creak coming from under the bed. But I was so tired, I didn't give it much thought and quickly fell fast asleep. I don't know how much time passed, but in a half-dreaming state, I felt a cold sensation on the top of my head and something sliding through my hair. I woke up completely, and what I saw made my heart stop. The landlady was sitting right next to my bed. One hand was rhythmically stroking my hair, while the other hand held a large kitchen knife. She had a twisted smile on her face, and her eyes were wide and bulging. She had been petting my hair. She had been inches away from me, and God knows for how long. I used every bit of strength I had to bolt upright, lunge out of the room, and run straight outside. I called 911 while I ran, my voice cracking from pure terror. The police arrived fast. They searched the room, tackled her, and took her away. I was in shock for days. Later, the police investigation revealed the whole truth. It turns out the landlady had a son about my age. He had been a victim of severe bullying for a long time and eventually took his own life. His death caused her to have a total mental breakdown. When she met me, because I looked a bit like her son, she began to see me as him. The medical staff added that her fingertips had thick calluses and her nails were worn down and tilted to one side. These were signs of repetitive touching and stroking over a long period. It wasn't accidental. It was a compulsive habit that had become part of her physical nature. Her murderous intent actually started that afternoon when she saw me and my best friend joking around. We were shoving each other's shoulders and using typical guy slang. In her warped mind, she believed I was being bullied just like her son had been. Fearing I would do something drastic, she came up with a horrific plan. She was going to kill my friend to protect me. That night, she had taken a knife and crawled under my bed hours earlier. She had been lying there patiently, waiting for the right moment to kill my friend. Luckily, my friend didn't stay over that night and went straight home instead. When she saw I was alone, she crawled out from under the bed and sat there, mesmerized, watching me sleep with the weapon in her hand. If my friend had stayed that night, a gruesome murder would have definitely happened. After it was over, I moved out immediately, but I still live in a state of high alert. My life is constantly filled with stress and exhaustion. Even now, 2 years later, I can still feel that cold hand stroking my hair in the dark. My name is Jordan, and I'm 35 years old. 2 years ago, my life hit rock bottom. I was suddenly laid off from my job. I wasn't prepared at all, and I didn't have a backup plan. In the days that followed, I survived on small unemployment checks from the state. I fell into a dark, empty headspace. My family is just me and my mother. We only have each other to lean on. My mom was in her 60s at the time, but she was blessed with a very youthful look. If she didn't tell people her age, everyone assumed she was only in her early 50s. She had owned and operated a small diner for over 10 years. Around the time I lost my job, my mom started suffering from back pain. I realized I couldn't keep living without a purpose while she worked so hard, so I decided to help her run the diner. I reorganized my mom's work schedule, Every day I had her go home to rest around 9 p.m. I would stay behind to clean up, balance the books, prep ingredients for the next day, and lock up the shop around 10 p.m. Everything went smoothly until one particular night. At about 9 p.m., an old man around 70 years old walked in. Since it was almost closing time, I initially refused to serve him, but he walked up to the counter and told me he was having a bad day and just wanted to buy a single bottle of beer. Maybe because I was going through a hard time myself, I felt bad for people who looked lonely. I agreed and grabbed the beer for him. After receiving the beer, he didn't leave right away. He sat down at a table near the counter and suddenly invited me to have a drink with him. I politely declined, saying I still had work to do. He stared at me for a moment, gave a cold smile, and didn't say another word. Near 10 p.m., he politely said goodbye and left, but his beer was still almost full. From that day on, he showed up every single night. The thing that started to feel weird was that he always arrived exactly when my mother left the diner. Every time he came in, he ordered just one beer, sat in the same spot, and always asked me to drink with him. I always said no, and he would just stare at me. That look, it was very uncomfortable. It wasn't exactly angry, but it was cold, like he was judging or studying me. I began to feel uneasy, but I just thought he was a lonely man who had a bit too much to drink and acted strangely because of it. Then came one night when he walked into the diner as usual, but he didn't order a beer right away. He stood at the counter and looked me straight in the eye. This time, his gaze was different. It was terrifyingly sharp and cold. "Do you know why I come here at this exact time every night?" he asked. I was a bit taken off guard by the question. I shook my head and told him I didn't know. Immediately, his face changed. He suddenly flew into a rage. His voice got much louder, and he demanded that I serve him a beer. The shift was so fast I didn't have time to react. I just figured he had mental health issues or was drunk. So I turned my back to get the beer just to end the interaction. But the moment I turned around, a sharp pain suddenly slammed into my back. My body stumbled forward. When I turned back, I saw him pulling his hand back after punching me. He didn't stop there. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a knife. Everything happened in just a few seconds. He lunged at me with a twisted smile on his lips and screamed with pure hatred, "If you just disappear, I'll finally be happy." He swung the knife wildly, and I couldn't dodge in time. I felt a cold sting as the blade tore through the skin on my shoulder and back. Warm blood immediately started to soak through my clothes. I gritted my teeth and ran out, pressing my hand against the wound to stop the bleeding. I asked the person on the street to call the police for me. A few minutes later, the police and an ambulance arrived, but I only wanted a quick bandage so I could go back to the diner with the officers. I was terrified that if I didn't return, my mom would come looking for me and run into him. When I went back with the police, I was shocked to see him still sitting there, as calm as if nothing had happened. The knife was gone from his hand, but his eyes were the same. When he saw me, he jumped up and yelled in anger, "I thought I made you leave!" The police immediately tackled and arrested him. After that, an investigation began, and the truth slowly came to light. It turned out he had been watching my mother for a long time. He often visited the diner during the day when I wasn't there and tried to flirt with her many times. My mother, of course, rejected him and kept her distance. Once she had told him directly, "My son is here now, please don't do this." To a normal person, that was just a polite way to say no. But to a twisted mind like his, those words were understood in a completely different way. He believed that my existence was the only thing stopping him from being with my mother. Therefore, he decided he had to get rid of me. What came out next was even scarier than I imagined. During the interrogation, he confessed that all those previous times he invited me to drink beer were part of a plan to kill me. He had secretly put cyanide in the beer bottles, but because I always refused, his plan failed. Finally, he switched to a direct method: intimidation, assault, and if necessary, murder. I was truly stunned. I had been so close to death without even knowing it. If I had been soft-hearted just once and agreed to drink with him, things would have ended very differently. For him, the story ended with a prison sentence, but for me and my mom, it was the opposite. The small diner had become a place of terrifying memories. What worried us most was that one day he might come back after finishing his time in prison. Ultimately, my mother and I made a difficult choice. We left everything behind. We sold the diner, packed what we needed, and moved to another state to start over. By now, things have settled down. I have a new job, and my mother doesn't have to work so hard anymore. The one bittersweet thing is that she gets very scared now whenever someone tells her she looks young and beautiful.